You're watching The New Stack Makers, a podcast for people who develop, deploy, and manage at-scale software. For more information and articles about at-scale technologies, please visit thenewstack.io. Now enjoy the show.
Hello, world. I'm Chris Pirillo, reporting and hosting conversations for The New Stack. Happy to do so, given that I'm learning things as I go along, not being someone who necessarily swims in the same space, but is utterly fascinated with developments as they unravel, because I only know things with what I see on my radar, reading the news. And recently, a bit of news caught my attention because I'm vegan. And you can see where I'm going with this already. OpenTofu launched. I was like, that's great. I open tofu all the time. I mean, it's a wonderful, I don't eat it all the time, but I do open it. So I thought, okay, I'm kind of familiar with the story. And then the more I started to dig into it, the more I realized I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. So I am not the subject matter, nor am I the subject matter expert. For that, we brought in Ohad, and he's going to go ahead and introduce himself. I've just met him a couple minutes ago, but certainly far more qualified to talk about tofu as potentially a non-vegan than I am, or at least OpenTofu. So Ohad, could you give us your background?
Yeah, definitely. Pleasure being here today. My name is Ohad Maislish, and I do two things. I'm co-founder and CEO of a company named N of Zero around infrastructure as code at scale and management and governance. And with that, I happen to be one of the co-founders of OpenTofu that we're going to discuss today. I'm not vegan, and I have an honest thing to say. I never, ever ate tofu.
Wow. Okay, so before, I guess I'll let you go ahead and give further background if you want, but now I'm really curious about how the name came about. Go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. So the name started by OpenTF. Okay, so when we decided to fork Terraform, we decided to go with OpenTF. Now, very quickly, because it was a very meaningful thing for the open source community, we started collaborating with the leadership of the Linux Foundation. For those who don't know, OpenTofu doesn't belong to a company. It belongs to the Linux Foundation, where CNCF is at, where Kubernetes, Istio, Open Policy Agent, and very open telemetry, very successful open source projects sit and ensure open source and governance from now until ever. So when we started talking with the Linux Foundation, they thought that the OpenTF name has a slight, may I say, risk when it comes to trademark. I'm not a lawyer, but they have tons of lawyers, which is good, but also sometimes they give their advice, which is valuable. And they thought that we need to get a bit further from the TF concept. So we had a lot of discussions what to name OpenTF. So we decided to switch it a little bit because OpenTF was already very successful as a brand. It got a lot of GitHub stars for a manifesto that we published. So a lot of people already started talking about OpenTF. So we wanted to correlate the new name with the existing name of OpenTofu, of OpenTF. So we just decided to switch to OpenTofu, which is nice and funny.
It really, I mean, genuinely, I was really curious. I'm like, is someone a tofu fan? But I guess not. So let's go ahead and kind of take a step sideways. Can you share with me the story about how OpenTofu came to be, specifically what motivated the creation of OpenTofu in relation to HashiCorp's license change?
Definitely. So let's go back a little bit in time. Terraform is a very successful project that was created by the early leadership of HashiCorp. For those who don't know, Michel Hashimoto, the company is named after him, Hashimoto. He's an amazing genius that created a lot of great technologies, including Terraform, that totally changed the way you operate with the cloud. Cloud is becoming code, and Terraform is the leading infrastructure as code framework to manage multi-cloud with code. And Mitchell and the team decided that Terraform and other HashiCorp projects would be open source to work together with the community and make it far more successful as a non-open source project. And Terraform was one of the biggest successes of HashiCorp, generating a lot of traction and collaboration from the big cloud vendors and other open source projects. And then HashiCorp became more mature as a company and made some legit decisions that were working with their vision. Some of those were not to accept community pull requests for Terraform because, according to their blog, they had a lot of priorities and it was challenging to handle all of the requests from the community. So back in September 2021, the license was still open source, MPL, Mozilla Public License, for Terraform, but it changed its culture of the Terraform project and became a more vendor-backed project than an open source project. That's back in 2021. 2 years later, on August 23, HashiCorp announced a big change to the license of Terraform and other projects such as Vault, Nomad, Consul, Packer, and other projects that they have. Almost all of their projects changed the license from MPL to BSL. And immediately a lot of companies, a lot of individuals, a lot of organizations realized that the future of Terraform is at risk. One of these companies is NF0, the company that I co-founded, and I am the CEO. And honestly, it's directly impacting our business. So for us, it was very clear that it's impactful and very meaningful to do something about that. But there were other companies, I want to mention Grantwork, for example, as the creators of TerraGrant, that were not directly affected by this change, but they realized what's going to happen when there is no open source. For example, one thing that immediately happened is that Alpine, a very familiar Linux distribution, and Brew, the default way to install packages on your Mac, on your Apple computers, they work only with open source. So Brew, for example, changed and basically deprecated support for Terraform. So you can no longer install the latest version of Terraform easily using Brew. You need to work around it. And there are other implications of risks to the users of non-open source software. I'm also a founder. Every time we raise money, we need to show the lawyers of the new company that we're using only open source, and we need to justify why we're using something that might not be open source. So honestly, we just use open source. So open source has its glue to other open source projects. So long story short, we at NF0, together with other companies, organizations, and individuals that were affected, decided that Terraform has to be open source forever. And because it's already 9 years old, it's a very reasonable job to do. Most of the innovation happened in the past. There is still a lot of more innovation to do, but it's already a mature project, and we can do what was done in the past in other situations and continue the actual mainline open source compatibility with Terraform and take it with the community-driven, impartial approach. That's what we did. We came together, we decided to support the future of open source alternative for Terraform. As I mentioned earlier, we immediately connected with the leadership of the Linux Foundation, which is the biggest and most relevant foundation to manage these projects. And now OpenTofu is a very stable, mature. We can talk about all of the great milestones we achieved, but that's the beginning of OpenTofu and how I was involved. I have some funny facts to share. For example, I was the one I think a few hours after HashiCorp changed their license, I bought the domain opentf.org, and I still have this email as a nice memory from the time that we immediately reacted and started working under the opentf.org domain, later on opentofu.org domain. So yeah, I was there in the early days together with some great partners and friends that important to mention. A lot of work that were done by others that are not from NF0, but we at NF0 gave our fair share as well.
And it sounds like, as you're telling me, the community reacted pretty quickly in terms of this license change going from open source to more of a business license. Was this pretty much almost immediate in terms of how they coalesced around forking and growing what would now become OpenTofu?
Yeah, it happened very quickly. By the way, the first thing we did was not a fork. The first thing we did is to create a manifest.
Okay.
And the manifest talks about why we think it's important to have open source license for the Terraform ecosystem. And we got a lot of pledges supporting that manifest. I think we got about 1,000 companies and individuals creating a pull request to actually share their pledges within the manifest.
So you had a vision, right, before really...
The first thing we did before writing any line of code was to write a document, the manifest, and share that manifest publicly and get about 1,000 pledges and get about 30,000, 35,000 GitHub stars on this manifest. And then we called the leadership of HashiCorp to consider reverting this change specifically for Terraform. We didn't ask anything about. It's not like we asked. We suggested that this is the natural thing to do because Terraform works with so many other open source projects that will be affected, and we thought that this will kill the Terraform ecosystem, and other alternatives to Terraform, such as Pulumi, Crossplane, CloudFormation, will increase, and this will involve huge migrations for so many companies. So we wanted to keep Terraform alive as open source. So we approached the HashiCorp leadership. Unfortunately, we didn't get any response to our approach. And then we decided to fork, to work with the Linux Foundation on hosting this new project with all of its intellectual property. And since then, we had actual releases, actual adoption by projects, by big companies. Not sure if you know, but just a few days ago, Oracle announced in their blog that their Cloud Manager product is no longer working with Terraform, and they switched to OpenTofu, and they force all of their Oracle customers to move to the new version to avoid usage of Terraform. So this is just yet one example, an interesting one, because it's Oracle. It's a big vendor that publicly mentions that it will no longer work with Terraform and will work with OpenTofu instead. So that's just one reflection of all of the progress and innovation and adoption we got so far.
I mean, I don't want to speculate, but let's go ahead and maybe unpack the idea of dependencies, right? When a company, any company, I'm not going to single anyone out, makes a change to a license that's this dramatic, there's a ripple effect. And the dependencies, if you will, right? On down the line, and they're going to have to make changes. Could you just, and you may know this or certainly understand this a bit better than I do, what would be the key differences between, specifically in relation to what happened in this situation, the key differences between the Mozilla public license and the business source license, the MSL versus the BSL?
So BSL, unlike other licenses, is a very flexible license. That means whatever I write in that license is the effect of this license. That's BSL. Okay, it's a very flexible license. Now, what HashiCorp did in their license is to mention some terms that add some risks for usage in several scenarios. They've mentioned the term production usage and a competitive offering. So if you're using production usage in an embedded way of a competitive commercial offer, you cannot use Terraform or Vault or other products. Now, this is honestly very unusual and very confusing. Unlike other non-open source licenses such as SSPL or other BSL examples in the history, for example, MariaDB if I remember correctly, had BSL, and they mentioned if you use more than 3 instances, that's violating the license. But that was a very simple definition, clear and simple definition. I honestly think that this move by HashiCorp was definitely valid. They have any right to do whatever they want with their assets. But for me and many others, it was confusing or not clear enough definition of what it means. And as a result, they added on their blog, on their website, a document with frequently asked questions that they keep on updating until this day with what it means. If I have a competitive offering, is it now or in the future? What happens if you develop something later on? What happens if I develop something later on? If I'm a partner now, is it okay? But if a year from now I'm not a partner of you, is that okay for me to use that? If I am using Terraform to build something that is competitive with another product of yours, is that okay or not? So many questions, and they kept on updating this blog, and they added a comment in that blog that this blog is legally binding. So a lot of confusion, and I think a lot of the things we see today with the adoption of OpenTofu are due to the fact that there are built-in risks in this kind of approach. Again, maybe that was the best decision for HashiCorp. I'm not sure, but it definitely created a lot of reactions, and then continuously updating their blog, their frequently asked questions blog about the licensing and making it a binding blog. It's a unique approach that I think causes a lot of folks from the community to find more stable alternatives to this technology. So that's something that happened and still happening, and we just all need to be aware of these facts.
And it's good. I mean, you from what I am hearing, that's all you're laying down is just facts. This change happened, this happened, then that happened. And I'm definitely not calling for speculation in a deeper sense. My question, or my next question really is, for those users and businesses currently using Terraform, what does the transition to OpenTofu look like?
Yeah, so currently, and probably in the near future, it's a switch. It's not a migration because it's fully compatible. If we talk about the versions, so up until 1.5, Terraform 1.5, it was MPL. So there is no OpenTofu 1.5. It's just Terraform 1.5. Now, version 1.6 was the first version by HashiCorp that was under the BSL license. OpenTofu has 1.6, and it's fully compatible. It's basically the same behavior with different implementation. And 1.7 version starts to be a little bit different. And honestly, OpenTofu has super interesting innovation in 1.7 that was widely spread in the social media, especially when it comes to state encryption, a long-awaited capability that is missing in Terraform and exists in OpenTofu 1.7. But other things in Terraform 1.7, almost everything exists in OpenTofu 1.7. So the migration is basically just execute tofu instead of execute Terraform. There is a migration guide in the OpenTofu website, which basically means back up everything and start using tofu. And if you want to move back to Terraform, you just move back to Terraform. It's not really migration. You don't need to change any code. That's the beauty of OpenTofu. Unlike migrating from Terraform to Pulumi or Crossplane or CloudFormation, that means a huge project of changing all of your code. When it comes to migrating to OpenTofu, you basically just need to start executing a different binary called tofu. Now, what's going to happen in the future? Probably, slowly, gradually, things will divert. And if you're using Terraform-only features, that are not in OpenTofu, and then you consider moving to OpenTofu, yeah, you might need to make some effort and stop using these specific things that are Terraform only. So far, there's barely anything like that. But that's probably what's going to happen. You're going to see some more innovation coming from OpenTofu. By the way, what we do, we have a GitHub page of all of the issues, and you can upvote. And that's our priority. We don't talk to any sales reps. We just see what the community wants, and it's done. State encryption is one great example among others. So back to your question, today, it's a switch. It's not a migration. Probably in the future, it's going to be a simple migration.
So you basically, honestly, you answered almost all the questions that I might have had in relation to this, like where people could get involved, potentially even a long-term vision for where you want to go with this, because it sounds like you've set the stage for success from the beginning, whether you're talking about your manifest or the organizations that you're working with, to seemingly future-proof something like this happening again.
Yeah. So regardless of OpenTofu, there is no such option of changing the license, because the license belongs, or the assets belong, to the Linux Foundation. That's I think in general, what I'm telling everybody from what I've learned in the past year, that you need to differentiate between open source and non-open source, and open source backed by a vendor versus open source backed by a foundation. Because open source backed by a vendor, it means it's open source today. It can be not open source tomorrow. Open source backed by foundations, it's open source today and will be tomorrow. So when you choose your technologies, what to use, you probably prefer open source, and that makes sense. And I think you should probably prefer open source backed by a foundation, such as Kubernetes. Kubernetes is in CNCF, in Linux Foundation. It will be open source forever. Terraform, we saw that it's not. Redis just changed their license, and then AWS, Oracle, and Google created Valkey within the Linux Foundation. So they did an OpenTofu move. By the way, in the AWS blog, talking about why they created Valkey, they mention OpenTofu and how they see the success of OpenTofu and how they want to follow the steps of OpenTofu. So we're honored to see that a company like AWS sees what we're doing and wants to follow the same approach that we're having here in OpenTofu.
Curious to know if this happens frequently. I did meet the Valkey, I guess, maintainers or creators of the project at the Open Source Summit in Seattle a few weeks back. Learned more about that. Is this something that's speeding up in terms of like happening where a company or a private entity holds on to an open source project and changes their mind, the community reacts? Because it just seems like this is a potential of like a rinse and repeat. Is this something that happens often? Is it a trend?
Is this a trend? I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. We definitely see an increase of these license changes from open source to non-open source. Again, open source that are backed by vendors become non-open source owned by those vendors. And we very often see an open source alternative. Sometimes it's backed by a foundation like OpenTofu or like Valkey, the alternative of Redis. Sometimes it's backed by another vendor that also creates an open source backed by another vendor. I think the biggest example to mention is Elastic Search, backed by Elastic, that changed its license to non-open source. And then Amazon created OpenSearch, which is open source, but not owned by a foundation. So we see more and more of these changes and these reactions. Whether that's going to be the default for all open source projects to change their license to non-open source, again, open source backed by a vendor, I don't think so. I think there is a lot of power that comes and success that comes with open source. Other projects feel more natural to integrate with that, and that's 1 + 1 = 3 with the value proposition to your users. So I think it's a mini trend, not a huge shift, but definitely some trend with more companies eventually making a rug pull on those licenses and their technology. That's just my 2 cents.
All right. Well, and that's what I was asking for. So thank you. I don't have as much perspective as you do, certainly because you are steeped in it. Thank you so much for spending time explaining it to me. Now I better understand it. Actually, 2 questions. One,
go ahead.
Are you now going to try tofu? And if you do, you got to put it with something. Don't just eat it raw. And 2, is there anything else that you might want people to know about OpenTofu that we might not have covered today?
I'll start with the first question. You need to talk with my wife. She's in charge of my progress with food, and I have a very limited capability. I don't eat tofu. I don't eat tomatoes. I don't eat avocado. I don't eat most of the types of cheese. I don't even drink coffee that you're drinking now. So I'm not the right person to talk about food or good drinks. I'm horrible at that. Now, the other question about OpenTofu. I urge everybody here to go to opentofu.org. We already have like more than 20,000 GitHub stars. It's a very big and successful project. As I mentioned, Oracle stopped using Terraform and switched to OpenTofu recently. JFrog recently added support for OpenTofu. Flux, the Kubernetes CD solution, updated about a week ago that all of its providers will be supported forever by OpenTofu. Brew, Alpine, not sure if I mentioned JFrog, GitLab, all of those support OpenTofu. Some of those deprecate Terraform, and I'm sure more to follow. OpenTofu is working with the community. Please upvote the things you want to see being implemented in OpenTofu. And you didn't even mention one very big thing that happened 2 weeks ago. So HashiCorp, the company behind Terraform and other projects such as Vault, was acquired by IBM about 2 weeks ago for $6-something billion. So the future of Terraform and the future of the entire HashiCorp technology is going to face a new home with some interesting opportunities, but also with some question marks on that future. So for those who want to better understand how to make decisions today, Terraform or OpenTofu, just reminding you all that another big thing happened that might affect your decision-making process, which is HashiCorp got acquired by IBM, or at least intend to be acquired. It's going to take probably 6 months or so to close that officially, but the deal is signed as of like 2 weeks ago. So just FYI, when you make some decisions which technology to use, bear in mind that HashiCorp got acquired.
Sounds like y'all are off to a rip-roaring start. So onward and upward. Ohad, I really appreciate you spending time again with us to better explain what's going on.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can always subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're on all the major social media platforms. You can always find us at thenewstack.io. We hope to see you soon.